All right, Alan Worst, RC Worst and Company here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about septic tanks today. First thing is, who owns a septic tank, or how do you know you own a septic tank where you live? Typically, if you live in a city, municipality, you have gravity sewer, goes to a big treatment plant. You probably don't have a septic tank in most cases. If you live in a rural area where you're not connected to sewer, you might have a septic tank and drain field, so this class might be of interest to you. So where's your septic tank located typically? It's usually located out in your yard somewhere outside of your home, connected to your sewer line. Sometimes you can find your sewer line by finding the cleanout cap near the foundation of your home. Normally your septic tank is somewhere close there in the proximity of that, probably 10 or 15 feet away from the home. So what goes in your septic tank? Well, that can vary by individual, but really what should go into your septic tank is all the waste from your toilets, sinks, showers. Try to keep any, if possible, of course depends on how your house is plumbed, but try to keep any runoff waste or any floor drains from going into your septic tank. That's usually ran into a separate system that handles that flow. That kind of flow can cause issues with a septic tank. In this particular example, you can see we've got basically the inflow here on the right, so the wastewater comes in on this side, and this is the out. Well, that'd be on the left. This is the outflow on the right, excuse me. So again, every time you run the sink or take a shower, flush a toilet, water goes in the septic tank, and the septic tank operates full essentially, or pretty much full. There's a little bit of freeboard in the top of the tank or a little bit of airspace, but when water comes in to the septic tank through the sanitary tee or baffle, it also pushes some water out of the septic tank through this particular sanitary tee or baffle. Of course, almost all septic tanks are buried in the ground. Some septic tanks include access risers, like the ones you see here. Those sometimes are made of concrete or other materials. The ones you see here are actually made of PVC. So what basically is the purpose of your septic tank? Your septic tank is designed, as I mentioned, to operate full, and the septic tank settles out the solids from your waste to clarify the liquids. So basically what you see here is a good depiction of a septic tank in that you have what we want to call a layer at the top of stuff that comes into the tank and floats up, and a layer at the bottom where stuff accumulates that sinks, and you have water in the middle that's essentially transported out of your drain field, saving your drain field from some of the solid material that comes out of your home. So basically, another really good question about a septic tank is, where does it go from here? If it's going on out after leaving the septic tank, where does it go? Well, it typically goes to a drain field system. Those drain field systems are designed to handle a certain amount of gallonage and a certain amount of semi-untreated waste or secondarily settled waste, and so that's sized appropriately for the size of your home. Alright, right now I'm going to talk a little bit about septic tank components, and again we talked about the tank itself. In this case you're looking at most likely a concrete tank. We have piping and sanitary tees, so on the incoming side here we've got an incoming pipe that comes from your home. This is what we call a sanitary tee, and so that's connected to the incoming pipe. The sanitary tee could be also a baffle, which is kind of built into the tank or bolted to the wall of the tank itself, but a sanitary tee is the most common. These sanitary tees actually direct the flow of the water down through the tee and through the scum layer of the tank, and then ultimately they introduce the solid waste and the liquid waste in the middle of the tank in the clear zone. And an important part of a tank is the distance between this sanitary tee and this sanitary tee. That basically gives the water and solid material some time to separate before it reaches the sanitary tee. So most septic tanks are somewhat rectangular shape if you look at them from the top, and so the long-wise water comes in the long side and moves across the tank and out the discharge baffle. In some cases, septic tanks, as I mentioned before, has risers and lids. It's a good idea to put risers on a septic tank. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but ultimately that would allow the homeowner or possibly a septic tank pumper access to the tank for inspections and pumping. The scum layer in the septic tank, you'll see basically right here, this brown material at the top of the tank. It's usually the lighter material, the greases and the oils that come in from the home, and that accumulates. Typically that doesn't break down very fast, but in most cases, if people aren't flushing a lot of greases down their toilet, or down their sink and in their tubs, that doesn't tend to get really thick really quickly. But that does a nice job of protecting the drain field, because we don't want those greases out in the drain field to plug off the porosity of the soil. We also have the sludge layer, and that would be the one down here at the bottom. And the sludge layer is essentially the stuff that sinks when it's coming into the system. So as I mentioned, you get a clarification as the water travels across. There's certain stuff that falls down and sinks into the bottom, and there's certain stuff that floats up, like I mentioned, that go up into the scum layer. So the sludge layer itself is usually digestible solids from your waste, and that stuff does tend to break down over time in the septic tank through anaerobic digestion. We talked earlier about the clear zone. I can't write very fast for some reason. So the clear zone is important in the septic tank, because ultimately the purpose of the septic tank is to clarify and separate the water from the solid material. So the clear zone is what you want to form in your septic tank, so the waste water that's coming out of the septic tank is fairly clear water. It's still kind of grayish in color and not real clear, but ultimately clearer than the water that would be coming out of the tank if all this stuff was mixed up. If I could, I want to go back to the sanitary tea, the inlet sanitary tea, and talk about its purpose a little bit. So if you didn't have a sanitary tea here, you would basically have water just free flowing from the home into the tank, and it would hit the scum layer, and every time water flowed into the tank, it would damage and break up the scum layer, basically rendering the scum layer ineffective or unable to form solidly and keep that scum at the top of the tank. So as you're bringing in that material, it's going to bring more material into the center of the tank, because it's going to be hitting that scum layer and busting up that scum layer. So you're going to be less likely to clarify the effluent. It also allows that waste to come in sort of in the center of the tank, so that the stuff that does float can float, and the stuff that does sink can sink, and it doesn't have a long distance to travel before it actually does either one. Once again, improving the clarification in the tank. At the discharge end, the sanitary tea looks the same, but it serves a bit different purpose. It actually picks up the water from the clear zone. So when water comes in the home side sanitary tea, just hydraulically, water is pushed out of the tank. If there was no sanitary tea on this side, it would just skim solids off the top of the tank, and that stuff would move out to the drain field. But in this case, it picks up water from the clear zone, pushes that up through the sanitary tea and out to the drain field itself. We talked a little already about the function of a septic tank. It is designed to settle solid material primarily. Some people refer to it as primary treatment. It also can store and separate the liquid waste, like we talked about. But the septic tank also does provide a level of treatment. And so a lot of people have some misconceptions about the frequency of pumping a septic tank. But ultimately, if a septic tank is properly matured and has been in use for a while, the scum and sludge layer create a biological colony basically inside the tank of microorganisms, of bacteria that digest the scum and sludge layer. Those bacteria are anaerobic, and so they don't have any air in there necessarily. They're not super efficient. They're not as efficient as the aerobic process, which maybe we'll talk about in a later video. But ultimately, some of the scum layer can get digested, and a lot of the sludge layer can get digested over time. So the larger the septic tank, that you buy and install, the more likely that bacteria is going to have a chance to break those layers down, and the less quickly that stuff will accumulate in the tank itself. Septic tank materials of construction, as I mentioned, this is probably a concrete tank, very common, the most common type of septic tank in the United States. Other construction materials include steel. Steel is really no longer used because they had a lot of problems with steel tanks rusting out over time, and so a lot of steel tanks are being replaced today with some of the other materials, including polyethylene. Poly tanks are another option. Poly tanks are nice because they're lighter than concrete, and so in some remote sites poly tanks can be installed. The cost is pretty low like concrete, but historically there's been some problems with poly tanks collapsing, and hopefully some of the tanks nowadays have solved that problem. And then finally, fiberglass. There's some fiberglass tank manufacturers. Fiberglass tanks are wonderful in terms of their ability to seal water tight, and they're very structurally sound, but the disadvantage of fiberglass is they're pretty expensive. So how do you size a septic tank? Well, a lot of times that is dictated on your state code or state rules, but the rule of thumb is you want to have about 2 times the daily peak flow coming out of the home. So if you've got normal usage coming out of your home, it might be 200 to 500 gallons per day. Most septic tanks for a standard size home are sized at about 1,000 gallons. Now, one of the things to consider in sizing a septic tank is if you do plan to have company, or if you've got a mother-in-law quarters or additional area or square footage where you can entertain guests for a long evening or a Super Bowl party, a larger tank might be a good idea, simply because you're gonna, during those times of peak flow, have a better chance of maintaining that clear zone and keeping the solid material from heading out the tank. So is larger better? Well, basically a larger tank to a point obviously will give you a better quality effluent going to the drain field, so it in some regards protects your drain field. It'll help increase the mean time between pumping, or decrease the frequency of your pumping intervals. And that's the nice thing about a larger tank, is you have more time for digestion. You tend to not have to service that tank quite as frequently, and for the low amount of cost for additional tankage up front usually is save that down the road in pumping costs. And again, as I mentioned, the cost of a larger tank is fairly inexpensive compared to what it might cost you down the road. Important to water tightness. Most tanks are fairly watertight. I have personally ran into a number of tanks that struggle with water tightness. I mean, why does it really matter? Why is it good that the tank's watertight? Well, basically you want to keep the water in the tank, and you want to keep water from outside the tank from getting in the tank. Also, the water on the outside of the tank, if you've got a high groundwater situation or rain and snow melt event, that water might actually contribute to the hydraulic flow that's going to the drain field, and it might also affect the tank's ability to settle out the scum and sludge. So you might be unnecessarily pushing solids out to the drain field during times when some water's coming in and moving water more quickly through the tank itself. I see a lot of problems in septic tanks that do leak. Typically they leak at the seams. In this case, this is a top seam tank, and so the seam is up here. That's a better design, in my opinion, to keep water out of the tank and keep water in the tank. Some tanks have a center seam, so there's a seam in this location. It's more likely, obviously, and you've got more hydraulic pressure if you've got water outside of the tank, and then of course you got water inside the tank that could leak out through that seam. And so a higher seam is usually better. I've seen leaking issues where the pipe penetrations go through the tank here specifically. I've seen leaky tank issues at the risers. Sometimes the risers aren't connected effectively at the tank itself. In this particular case, these risers are actually cast in the concrete. And I've also seen voids in tanks, in concrete tanks primarily, where for whatever reason the concrete didn't get vibrated into some of the air areas, and so there was voids in the tank leak there as well. So it's really important, again, to have a watertight tank, because that maintains the integrity of the process in the tank and maintains the liquid levels in the tank so the tank can function correctly. So septic tank pumping, I'm going to talk quickly about that. And I think septic tank pumping is important, don't get me wrong, but I do think it's important to pump your septic tank when it's necessary, not before it's necessary. As I mentioned, the biological breakdown in these septic tanks, for that to occur most efficiently, it takes a little while in that tank to form the scum and sludge layer and that anaerobic bacteria colony. So if you go in frequently and pump your septic tank out, you're not getting, the full effectiveness of the treatment, because you're basically disrupting that process every time you do that. There are ways to test or measure the scum and sludge in a septic tank, and that's important to do, in my opinion, before you pump a septic tank, or again, with that measurement you can determine whether or not the septic tank needs pumping at all. So that can, as a homeowner, save you money in the long run. And what they basically do is they've got a little stick that goes down, and you can kind of feel the bottom of the scum layer. It's got a measuring deal on it. It's not a fun job, but it's something that is probably a lot better than pumping a septic tank. You also have a tube that goes down and kind of takes a core sample of the sludge area, and when you pull that up, you can see how deep that sludge is. You usually want to pump the tank. In this particular case, this tank is in good condition, doesn't need to be pumping, but if you get within 3 to 6 inches of this sanitary T opening on the outlet, that's when you really probably want to pump the tank, because now you're at the point where there's a chance you're going to send solids out to the drain field, and so the tank needs to be pumped at that point. As far as care of your septic system, it's pretty simple, really, and a lot of people that are on septic systems understand this, but some people that have transitioned from city systems to septic systems tend to flush pretty much everything they use down the toilet, including all kind of wipe products, and of course they say they're flushable, but they're basically not. It's been pretty well proven. I think a lot of municipalities don't like those products either, because they tend to plug up pumps and whatnot, but they really accumulate quickly in the septic tank, and that's usually what forms in the scum layer. So flush only toilet paper and human waste down your toilets. Of course, you're going to drain tubs and showers and sinks. In some cases, you're going to have a garbage disposal. I recommend scraping your dishes off in the garbage, and then you can spray them off and run the garbage disposal briefly after meals. Just try not to overload that garbage disposal, because a lot of that stuff coming out of there will contribute to the scum and sludge layer and cause the tank to require pumping more frequently than if you had used good practices. Definitely do not flush fats and greases or grease and oil down the tank. Normally a lot of people that baking grease and different things, they'll flush it down the sink. Put that stuff in the garbage, because that stuff will accumulate in the tank and cause issues eventually in the drain field. Possibly if it doesn't tend to float out, it might actually go to the drain field and plug off the porosity of the soil. Drain cleaners are really hard on the biology in a septic tank, so if you constantly use drain cleaners, that stuff's a really harmful chemical. Never flush paint, household chemicals, prescription or non-prescription drugs. Really, we don't want the prescription and non-prescription drugs, some of those chemicals, in the environment, so those things should be disposed of in the landfill. Also have your tank levels checked periodically. As I mentioned, it's a good practice to call a septic tank pumper, ask them if they will check the layers before they pump it. If you find one that does, that's probably an honest pumper. Again, as I recommended, don't pump your tank unless it's needed. So in some cases, for a real estate transaction or other property exchanges, it's a requirement from the bank that you pump the septic tank, and I think that's really kind of a bad idea. I think the tank should be tested for scum and sludge depth, and if it doesn't need to be pumped, then it's probably operating and in good condition. The last thing I really want to talk about is access risers to grade. Most people don't want a lid in their yard, and I get that. I understand that that's not something people want to look at. Most of these lids, at least most of the modern lids, are green to match the lid. Of course, you have to weed eat and mow around them. In some cases, you can have concrete risers put on tanks. The problem with concrete risers are that the lids are super heavy, so they're really hard to get off, and the risers themselves tend not to seal as well to the tank, so that could be a kind of a leaky point. With these PVC risers, you can either cast the riser in the tank like you see here, or you can cast a riser adapter into the tank, or you can bolt that riser adapter to the tank with some special mastic and stainless steel anchors, and then attach the riser to that riser adapter, and that provides a watertight, structurally sound seal to the top of the tank itself. But the risers themselves, as I mentioned, give you access to the tank. There's nothing worse than running into a problem with your septic system. Maybe you get a backup in the home and you can't find the septic tank, so you're potting all around your yard trying to find the tank. You're using, a piece of steel to try to locate the thing to tap down into the soil, see if you can find the top of the tank. And there's nothing worse than having to dig the tank up and access it that way. But if you've got risers to grade, it eliminates all that expense and frustration trying to locate the tank. And so I would recommend to anyone who installs a new tank to ask for risers to grade. It's very simple to install them. When your tank is first installed, obviously, or tank is first set in the ground, and then they can backfill it, and then you've always got access. You can always check your tank. Another important note is if you've got lids on a septic tank, you definitely want those lids to be mechanically fastened to the riser, not just set on the tank. And definitely if you remove a lid, don't walk away from that opening. Make sure that you're available and you've got your eye on that location. There have been a few issues fairly recently where young children have fallen in septic tanks and died, and so it's kind of a scary situation to leave a septic tank unattended if the lid is off, or leave a septic tank with the lids not structurally fastened down to the tank itself. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. If you get any questions, leave them in the comments, and please subscribe to our channel. Thank you very much.